If you're an ecom brand, you should stop copying brands like AG1, Rode, Aura, Im8, and Glossier. So if your brand is less than 3 years old, you should never be copying these brands that have started over 5 years ago, or those that are heavily funded / celebrity backed. So brands, as you can imagine, like your AG1, Im8, Rode, Aura, Glossier, but also brands like Fenty, Skims, Hims, Aura, Lemmy, Whoop, all of these brands that everyone seems to copy. And in this video, I'm going to break down exactly why you shouldn't be copying them and what you should be doing instead. So first things first, the numbers themselves. Every other post on social media, as I'm sure you've seen, is a breakdown of these winning ads from AG1 or a full breakdown of Rode's email flows, the funnel behind Im8's $100 million ARR. All of these posts tearing down the funnels, the strategies, the ads of these brands that I've mentioned. But what these posts fail to explain is the balance sheet behind these brands. So of course, Rode, founded in 2022 with Hailey Bieber, they were sold to ELF in 2025 for $1 billion. The founder, of course, is one of the most famous faces on this earth. Every single product drop of theirs is covered by free press. Therefore, their ads themselves never even had to be profitable. AG1, their investors include Lewis Hamilton, Hugh Jackman. They've raised over $100 million. They launched over 15 years ago using podcast sponsorships, people like Andrew Huberman. That only works when you have deep cash reserves and a subscription LTV that they've spent over a decade optimizing. Im8, of course, they are leveraging David Beckham's face and money from Prenetics, the parent company. From day one, they had global press. They had these massive retail relationships and celebrity distribution. And then even Glossier, they've raised $250 million, and they still, despite that, had very much stalled growth. Their valuation got cut. They had to reboot, go into retail via Sephora in order to be able to survive. All of these brands, they can afford to lose money for years, almost deliberately. That itself is their strategy. And if you can't do that, then you should not be copying the same playbook as them. Now, from a unit economic perspective, everything always reduces to one thing. Of course, how quickly can you get your acquisition cost back? It's the old CAC to LTV, that ratio, that is the North Star. But for these brands, their cash runway is years, whereas yours is likely months. Their acceptable CAC payback is probably around 9 to 12 months, potentially even longer. Yours is most likely in the next 30 to 60 days. They have millions and millions of warm followers and press on tap. You don't have that. And they literally plan to lose money on their first orders. Whereas if that were to happen to you, it would leave you bankrupt. Now, according to publicly available research, the median acquisition cost in this space is roughly around $150 per customer. Now, this is up around 60% over the last 5 years, but it roughly stands currently in the DTC world at around $130 to $150 per customer. So hypothetically, let's say we have two brands. They both sell a $60 product with a $35 contribution margin per order. They both pay $130 to acquire a customer. So the funded brand, like the ones that I've previously mentioned, would see a $95 loss on the first order. But once that subscription kicks in by roughly month 9, they are break even. And then by month 12, 18, they are absolutely printing and they are profitable. And they can afford to run this at scale because the raise covers that gap in between the spend and the payback. Whereas for a brand like you that hasn't got that celebrity backing or funding, you have the same $95 loss, but then the next ad payment of yours comes out of this month's revenue and your cash conversion cycle eats away at you simply because of the unit economics. The math itself, you cannot cover. And also the celebrity part is massively underrated from a unit economic perspective. Obviously, when it comes to acquisition, the single highest leverage factor is trust. And if you think about it, really for these brands, their traffic is never really that cold. They're never really having to search for cold audiences. Years and years of Hailey Bieber's content pre-sold Rode. Huberman himself spent years and years telling people that he drinks AG1. So when someone sees an ad for these brands, they're never really a cold audience. It's never cold traffic that they're selling to because of that pre-warming. And it's exactly why these brands, Rode, AG1, Whoop, all of the above, they can afford to make these aesthetic, very minimal on-brand creatives because they are doing a different job. And that's why you see so many brands trying to copy this strategy, copy the same format, layout, creative that Rode have been running for the last 12 months, for example, and they don't see success because they don't have a Hailey Bieber that's pre-warmed their audience for the last 12, 24, 36 months to be able to then use this strategy because they don't need to worry about that conversion, that trust, that social proof, because these brands have already done that. So yes, like I said, when you copy this strategy, you are missing the part that they've spent years and years building beforehand. So then, as I said, when you copy their strategy, for example, with Rode, you take these very aesthetic ads that have no claims, no social proof. But if you are an unknown brand, you have then a nice looking aesthetic ad, but it doesn't answer any of the buyer's questions. So of course, it's not going to work as effectively as these ads are for Rode. For AG1, if you try and copy their strategy of sponsoring podcast and creators, which is always at a flat upfront fee and rate, before you have any data on your LTV, you will end up waiting months and months for attribution that you can't even then read because it's from a podcast, and waste all of your runway on just brand awareness. If you try and copy the approach that Glossier took, which is a very community-first approach with barely any direct response, they had $250 million and a media empire before the brand even launched. Now, for most brands, community is a compounding channel for later on, not an immediate acquisition channel. And for Im8, if you try and copy the premium pricing that they have, which has been justified by their quality-led positioning, which is basically just David Beckham's face de-risking everything, if you follow that, you will just raise the trust bar even higher. You will have to do even more to gain people's trust to justify that pricing, which is going to be impossible for you to do because you don't have David Beckham or equivalent selling your product. The pattern, as I mentioned, is always the same. You inherit the costs that these brands have to undertake without any of the advantages that allow them to undertake those costs in the first place. So then instead, who should you be copying? Well, there are two types of brands, but in short, bootstrap brands that are actually playing the same game as you. So number one, brands that have found traction recently in the last 12 to 18 months. And number two is bootstrap brands that are now big. So ideally, you want to find brands that are scaling on their own cash, whose ads are basically having to work at the same unit economics and within the same market as you. Or you look at some of these bigger brands like Ridge, True Classic, Snow's another great example, who are of course bigger now, but studying them at the stage that you are currently at. So yeah, brands like Purdy and Fig, Obvi, Snow I mentioned, Bamboo Earth, Javi Coffee, Hunter and Gather, Midday Squares, Dag Co. These are great examples, as you can see with Purdy and Fig. They went from a garage startup to a 40 million cleaning business. Snow Teeth Whitening were fully bootstrapped and they've gone to $100 million in sales in just 3 years. All of these brands are so much better to take inspiration from compared to those previous examples because they all have an offer that has been designed for fast payback, so subscription bundles, high margin hero SKUs before scaling their spend. They have creative volume from their customers and creators. They have trust manufactured inside of the ad. It's direct response with social proof because there is no fame or celebrity doing it for them. And they have an obsession with margin because their margin is their runway, unlike these VC-funded, celebrity-backed brands. In terms of how to copy these brands, it's very simple. And again, when I say copy, I want to actually clarify what I mean by this because even though it's a very common strategy in the game, there are going to probably be people wondering what it looks like to copy a brand without copying them directly. Now, when I say copy, of course, it always draws me back to the most common and well-known phrase that good artists copy and great artists steal. So what I mean by that is not necessarily completely ripping what a brand is doing, but stealing the concept, the angle, and then recreating that for your brand. So very simply, finding a brand in the meta ad library that fits the description of this right here. Sort for longest running ads, find the ads that are working for them, make sure they don't have funding, make sure their founder doesn't have an abnormally big audience, and check the timeline for how long they've been running for. But again, importantly, you want to steal their system, not the ads directly. So what are the angles that are running behind their creatives and how can you recreate that angle for your brand? What offer structure are they using? How are they testing their creatives? What's the cadence? What are they using here? What proof formats work best for them? How can you take inspiration from what they're doing and what's working for them to be able to recreate that for your brand? Now, to wrap this up here, my point very simply is that AG1's playbook worked for them starting in 2010 with a decade of runway and $1.2 billion. Rode and Im8, they worked and scaled successfully because Hailey Bieber and David Beckham exist. And like I mentioned as well, even Glossier's own playbook failed for themselves despite the massive cash injection and the media empire that they had. Strategy is very simply downstream of constraints. Constraints are what inform your strategy. Their biggest constraint is how quickly they can grow. For most brands, it's the cash they have available. So my recommendation and advice to you is copy the brands that got where you want to be next year with the cash that you actually have available. So with that being said, I hope you found this video valuable and useful and gave you a different perspective on all of these social media posts that advise you to copy and steal Im8, AG1, all of these strategy funnel ad breakdowns, but don't actually take into account the numbers behind them. And like I said, just give you a fresh perspective on a better way to approach this with what's realistic and who's playing the same game in the same market with the same economics as your brand. Comment below if there's anything that you'd like to see in the next video or if you found this useful. And with that being said, I'll see you in the next one.